So now I'd like to show you a little bit about this debate that I had um, with Omar Barghouti. And I'll pull up once again the share screen. And let's talk a little bit about how I asked the question, how the questions were asked to me and how I responded to them. Let's take a look.
A Palestinian-led campaign against Israel. It's called Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, or BDS.
BDS aims to end injustice and inequality and denial of human rights.
What is your response to that?
Okay, so, I have two basic rules when it comes to a debate or a conversation or anything like that. One, try to be smart and likable. You want to have just enough knowledge and jargon and facts to make it clear that you know what you're talking about, but not so much that you seem kind of cold and heartless. And the second is meet people where they are, which might not be where you are. Different people have different values. Someone who leans to the right might be more interested in issues like security. Someone who leans to the left might be more interested in issues like human rights and progressive values. I personally believe that Israel can win on any of those topics. We're a real country, or a modern, liberal, Western democracy, which is a phrase that I often repeat. And whether you're speaking to people on the right or on the left, people who are young, people who are old, if you know where their values are and where they're coming from, you can speak about Israel in a way that meets their values. That's not, by the way, true for every topic with every issue or country in the world, but I do believe it is true for Israel. So I said, you can see that Omar Barghouti is doing that very well. He's throwing in all those progressive buzzwords that are really touching to young people: denial of human rights and equality, and it really is engaging and touching. So how am I going to counter that, right? Am I going to go and then say human rights don't matter, equality doesn't matter, Palestinians are all terrorists? I start talking that way, and guess what? You're going to see you're going to really alienate people who care about that. I notice someone here is raising her hand. We're going to take questions at the end, so please definitely raise your question or write it in the comments, and we'll take it at the end. But I do care about the question, and I will definitely answer it. So the question is, how are you going to answer this in a way that that reaches people where they are and makes you appear smart and likable and touching the values that are relevant to your audience? Remember, my audience here is not Omar Barghouti. My audience is all the people watching who I can't even see. And so you just have to have a sense of who you're talking about and talking to. So fortunately, I'm familiar with Barghouti, and I did a little research in advance, and here was how I answered.
Well, my response is really not relevant. I think what's important is Mr. Barghouti's response. In 2013, he said in a lecture, and I quote, "Definitely, most definitely, we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. The purpose of the BDS movement is to put an end to the Jewish state of Israel in any borders whatsoever. It's a destructive movement. And what's most disturbing is that the movement misleads young people who really do care about social justice."
So you see what I did there? I'm talking about, there's three kinds of people in the world. People who already agree with you, and there's no point in trying to convince them of anything. People who will never agree with you, and there's no point in trying to convince them of anything. And then there's the vast majority of people, who are people who could kind of go either way, either because they don't care about the issue that much, or they don't know about it that much, or whatever it is. And those are really the most important people to speak to, first of all, because it's the majority of people, and second of all, because it's the place where you actually have a chance of making a difference. So if somebody says, if somebody really believes in progressive liberal values and human rights, they don't want to see equality, they don't want to see injustice, but they also don't want to see Israel destroyed, or Israel destroyed as a Jewish state. And by pointing out that this is what Omar Barghouti, in his own words, is really advocating for, it allows me to tap into those values without disagreeing with those values. Now, a lot of people who are involved in BDS don't really believe those things, but the leaders of BDS are leading that movement in this direction. And the young people who take part in it should understand what they're being a part of.
Palestinians are living not just under military occupation, not just under a system of colonization, but under a system of apartheid. So BDS aims to end this oppression so that Palestinians can enjoy freedom, justice, and equality.
Look at that. Apartheid, oppression, freedom, justice, and equality. He's hitting all the right words. He's doing the things that I teach really well. So now what are you going to do? And if we were in a smaller group, I might actually ask you and have you answer, and we could have a little back and forth. We're in a group that's just too large to make that practical. But I'll tell you, when I do this, a lot of times I'd say to someone, all right, how would you answer this? And the answer usually would be, well, say Israel is not an apartheid state, and Israel is not oppressive, and Israel doesn't have inequality. And it's so tempting to do that, but it's a trap, because what you've done is what psychologists and people who work in marketing, which are very related fields, call you're creating a word association, where now you've just said the word Israel and the word apartheid together in the same sentence, and Israel and oppression, and Israel and inequality over and over again together in the same sentence. And you're also being on the defensive, and you're playing his game, and it's not a productive way to go. So what can you do? What I did is to say, instead of talking about what Israel isn't, I'll talk about what Israel is. So the question is, how do I talk about Israel not being an apartheid state without using the word apartheid and without using the word not? And while I was at it, because I know a bit of Omar Barghouti's history and had done my homework in advance, I was able to chip away a little bit at his credibility while I was at it.
Mr. Barghouti was born in Qatar. He was raised in Egypt, and he got his degree at the University of Tel Aviv, where he studied together with Christians and Jews and Arabs, all experiencing equal rights and equal opportunity in a country where Arabs serve as Supreme Court justices, as lawyers and doctors and actors, and everything that human beings do, including members of government. And when asked about this at UCLA in 2016, Mr. Barghouti said that they were collaborators.
All right, so you can see how I did that there, which is first discrediting him a little bit. You know, this isn't a guy who grew up in some refugee camp. This is a very privileged person from a privileged family who grew up in countries around the world before finally attending the University of Tel Aviv, for goodness sake. You know, if you know what apartheid is, you know it's a place where you can't attend university together. And of course, Israel is a country where Arabs and Jews and Christians and Muslims do everything. Now, Israel is not a perfect country. And if this were a real in-depth discussion and not a debate where I have to answer everything in a few seconds. By the way, this was a 20-minute debate. I'm just showing you clips from a highlight reel here. But even in a 20-minute debate, on any given question, I may only have a minute to answer. So I can't get into the deeper thought, which is Israel has as much racial tension and discrimination as any other modern Western liberal democracy, and it's not perfect. But it's a country where everyone's equal under law. It's a country where even with the challenges that we have with racial relations, we still have people of all minorities, including Arabs, serving in every position, from government to arts and entertainment and everything. And as I was talking about in the segment, doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have tensions, but Israel is more like the United States or the United Kingdom or Canada or Australia than it is like, say, some dictatorship where people really don't have rights. And that's the point that I'm trying to make in this, which is to put Israel in that category. You know, I don't go say, oh, well, what about Iran? Oh, what about Saudi Arabia? No, I don't even want to compare Israel to countries that are at such a problematic level. I want to compare Israel to the countries that really are trying to do well, even if they don't succeed perfectly.
So because the movement is beginning to have an economic impact, even with major pension funds pulling their investments from Israeli banks or international companies involved in Israel's human rights violations, this is precisely the traction that Israel dreads.
If it really were, you wouldn't be able to use your computer or your cell phone. You wouldn't be able to access much of the clean drinking water on Earth or many of the medications that you use. These are the kinds of exports that Israel creates. A great example is SodaStream. BDS pressured them to move their factory, which costed hundreds of Palestinians their jobs.
How can one be critical?
So you can see what I said there was, I talked about some of innovations that Israel has. This is very tricky. It's very tempting to want to. I know I froze it on a frame here where my mouth is open in a weird way, so don't laugh at me too much. It's very tempting in this BDS debate to say, "Oh, you want to boycott Israel? You better stop using your cell phone, your computer, and your vaccinations, your medicines." It's a little bit of a trap because if somebody really is liberal-minded and thinking about progressive values and human rights, their reaction to you might be, well, just because Israel invents a lot of things doesn't mean that you have the right to oppress people, which is why I spent most of my time saying Israel does not oppress people. I'm not saying what Israel does is okay because Israel invents things. I'm saying that what Israel does is okay because it really is okay, because it really is, there really is equal rights and equal opportunity, and the criticisms are unfair. I'm mostly focused on that. It was just at one point right in the middle where he gave me the opportunity to speak a little bit about the positive things that Israel does. So I put that in the middle, but it wasn't my main focus. And had this been a shorter debate where I had less time and had to really choose which topics I was going to hit, that probably wouldn't be the number one topic I would hit. I would stick to the ones where I really make the point about how Israel is right and doing right on an ethical and moral level. But given that I had the opportunity, it was a reasonable thing to throw in there. Now, this is a really critical question he's about to ask, so I want you to put some thought into it.
Jobs.
How can one be critical of Israel and Israel's policies without being labeled anti-Semitic?
Okay, how can you be critical of Israel and Israel's policies without being labeled anti-Semitic? There's so many ways you could go, and it's really tempting to say which policies, what policies do you have a problem with? Israel's policies really are mostly fair and thoughtful. It's tempting to want to say that, but look, the truth is Israelis disagree about Israeli policies, and at Honest Reporting, our job is not to defend Israel blindly. It's to work to make sure that Israel is treated fairly. We've defended Israel for 20 years. And in that time, there have been prime ministers in Israel on the right, left, and center, and American presidents, Republican and Democrat. And but our defense of Israel has always stayed, no matter who the prime minister was or who the president was. And so, our job is not to defend every single Israeli policy, but to defend the fairness toward Israel. So here in this last segment, the reason I included it is because I bring everything together. Remember, being smart and likable, reaching people where they are. So you'll see that the first thing I did here is I took this very serious question and I started with a smile, and then I made a little joke, and then I talked about something lighthearted, and then I brought it back around to something serious, and I included some facts and some history, but not too much, and brought it all together with reaching people where they are in their values while also being smart and also being likable. And I put it all together here.
Well, if you're critical of Israel and Israel's policies, you have something in common with just about every person in Israel. We have a joke that we have 9 million prime ministers because everybody thinks they're right. But I'll tell you what, in the world there are 57 Muslim states. There are over 100 Christian states. There are 6 Buddhist states. There's only one Jewish country. It's one of the smaller countries in the world with a size less than New Jersey and a population less than New York City, and it is the only one that is singled out by BDS, not for criticism, but for total destruction. Now, I'm not saying that singling out the world's only Jewish state for total destruction is anti-Semitic, but I can't imagine what else it would be.
All right, so that is our segment. I hope it's helpful for you.